Hi, y'all. Welcome to another episode of the Home for Humanity podcast. I am your host, holistic realtor, Sarah Liljegren. I sometimes struggle with introducing myself as a holistic realtor, but I kind of can't get away from my approach to real estate as one that encompasses the wholeness of our human self. And that is why today I am interviewing anthropologist Josh Sterlin, a friend of mine who I met at Wilderness Awareness School. And in this interview, we discussed that and what we both learned there, and what we've gone on to do since our immersion years at WAS, and what anthropology has to say about the human experience and how that's related to nature, and what my take on real estate is as a new agent, and why I decided to get into the real estate world, because like I say in this interview, it's just a strange industry to me for so many reasons. All of the variables that come together to create help for one person from move to one place on the earth to another place, and all that goes into that. And why do we do that? Why has it historically been a human thing for people to move across this land and struggle so much in the process? It's a painful thing, and we discussed that as well. Why getting by. And in my last interview with Patty, I touched on that. Like, are we resourced enough to do these things? And in this discussion with Josh, I kind of realized it doesn't matter if we're resourced enough. We're not going to change the world on our own. And what can we as individuals do about it? And getting involved in our community and engaging with each other and our neighbors seems like the best way we've found. So I hope you enjoy this interview, and I hope you continue to help me reimagine a home for our whole humanity, not just our houses, not just our bodies, not just our families, or our chosen families, or our friends, or our communities, or the city we live in, or how we get across the land, and what we do with the land, and how we connect with the land, but actually all of those things together, and how they all integrate, and the confluence of them all, and the confluence of all the crises that we find ourselves in these days. We can't get out of this collected tragedy without a collected effort and hope and a light for a better future. So without further ado, I give you Josh Sterlin. Hi, Josh. How are you doing?
I'm well, Sarah. How are you?
I'm well. Um, it's funny how before this you're both like, well is a blanket statement, but life is life, and that's what I want to talk about today is life.
Sorry, but perhaps I should have said well enough.
Okay. Okay. Enough. Well enough. I used to that used to be kind of a habit around my household, is like good enough. And I was like, I don't want to say that anymore, but I'm coming back around to the enough side. Can you um maybe we'll get to that. So how do we know each other? Maybe let's start there. We met through Wilderness Awareness School. So, do you want to talk about your relationship to Wilderness Awareness School, what you did there, what you do now?
Yeah. So, we met this past spring at the Wilderness Awareness School while you were going through the Immersion program, and I was doing my ethnographic fieldwork because I'm a environmental anthropologist. I'm a PhD candidate at McGill University in Montreal. Um, Hopefully, in the last year of my degree, takes a significant period of your life. And so I was back at WAS to as my old research methods professor used to call it, uh, just engage in some deep hanging out, or what's more formally termed participant observation. So I had like you been a student of the immersion program, I think in 2013, 2014. And then I went on to be an apprentice instructor and take the wildlife tracking intensive and just generally hang out and work on my skills and whatnot in the community. And I had gone actually because when I was doing my undergraduate in anthropology, my one of my good friends there had just come back from WAS, and she had convinced me once our undergraduate was done to go. I had already been thinking about doing these kinds of things. I had been considering the teaching drum outdoor school actually before when I was a few years younger. But yeah, I found myself facing a world where I didn't know what I wanted to do, and so I went out to the West Coast, and she's now a professor, and perhaps I will too. So WAS can count some profs among the grads. Um, and yeah, so I've been back to the school a few times in the years since, and I was hoping to come during, I think, 2019, which was, became illegal for me to cross the border into the United States, so I couldn't. So I divide my time up here in Canada. And so, yeah, I'm studying, I guess, WAS as the sort of central, I don't know, a focus of gravity of the nature connection movement. And what the nature connection movement sort of what it does as an emerging culture, and how its methods seek to rewild human beings and their cultures, and what that, the complexities of that, which there certainly are complexities, and fraught questions, and social cohesion and social strife, and but I think that the methods of connection offer something for understanding the human place in the world, and also for maybe encountering the present confluence of crises that we are quite obviously facing.
Confluence of crises. I love that. I actually just last night was like, man, I use the word crisis in my marketing a lot. And I don't like being an alarmist or using fear as a tactic, but a lot of my why for what I've been doing since WAS is because of this fear in me that we are at a confluence of crises. So we were speaking about the housing crisis and like not being able to afford things in a short amount of time, like what that's doing to people. Do you want to say more maybe about this confluence? That's all, like maybe that's too big of a question about how they're related, but just some highlights of what you meant and what you see and the way your take on it, how you're involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think the present moment is often overshadowed in its description by sort of like basically climate fear. If we're talking about the environment, people are really, really concerned about the climate, as they very much should be. But there are a confluence of environmental crises that are not just precipitated by CO2 emissions. They're going to be exacerbated by them, but the biodiversity crisis is equally alarming. And on the other hand, as you all know quite well down there in the States, there seemingly seems to be a moment of real social dislocation, a sort of fraying of identity, of social solidarity, of sort of a sense of what binds us together as part of a sort of common project, right? And this is all exacerbated by, increasing capitalist capture. The last 5 years have been, well, more than the last 5 years, but the last 5 years have really exacerbated, cost of living crises, healthcare crises. And I mean, I think these are properly crises, though, we get rather attuned to them. But, we don't live in settled times, certainly. And perhaps that provides an opportunity. I don't, I don't, I have the humility to not make sweeping historical statements. But it's clear that we need to live otherwise in some way. Particularly we in North America, we in the industrial world. It's not working. It's not working for people largely. It's not working for our relationship with the natural world. And so I think what interests me about WAS and places like WAS, all the other nature connection schools, and the sort of larger subculture that they're part of, is that, they're doing something, and perhaps I shouldn't say they, we are doing something, um, from doing on the ground practices, experiments, innovations, however messy and complicated they are. They're doing something that, for me in the academy, many people are calling for and have been calling for, right? To learn how to live otherwise, learn how to relate to nature otherwise, learn how to think of the person, the subject differently, to think of non-humans differently. And I think that places like the, Nature Connection, and, it's obviously not only, the Nature Connection movement, but I think the Nature Connection movement is really interesting because it's very conscious about this activity, and very conscious of it being a sort of nascent project, right? It's still in the process of being built, this new, or perhaps old. I think a lot of people think of it as old, or a return to something old, but it's still in the process of being made, which I think is a really interesting, you know, orientation to it.
Yeah, because I mean, if I've the past few years just seeing the trends and my interest in the cost of living crisis kind of stems from the past few years. I've seen that gap of I don't remember the language you just used, but like the gap between the people who can afford a place to live and who can't is just gotten so wide very quickly. And so this recreating of culture, we talked before about the expression of different cultures and the shattering of identities, and all this is kind of blurring together for me right now. And like, how do people adopt a new identity and a new way of expressing this need of being connected to the world? I mean, in this very moment, you caught me at a weird time because I just rewatched this public statement I made at the Port Townsend City Hall meeting, which I'm like, oh man, I was too nervous to make a public statement because it was kind of all over the place. But it came from this like, hey, Seattle just lost 255 acres of tree canopy, and just approving more little houses to be built means that people are going to cut down more trees to make these little houses and then sell them at a higher rate than they could if we were to just rethink this. And they were talking about creative ways of housing too. So this is kind of my interest, but my question for you kind of around that is how do people, if they think, well, what can I do? Well, within different cultures, maybe expressing more of a serious approach to the nature connection, identity, maybe like that need is there and it does require some sort of identity. And afterward I was like, man, I don't want to make public statements in like the light of an activist trying to be a professional, but like, how do I come at this with that's just my fear. But yeah, how can we take on this identity or depending on what people are coming from and what they want to express in a new way?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we don't remember, or it doesn't appear to us because we're so ensconced um, in the way things are, that everything is a choice. And I think this is a very famous line by the recently deceased anarchist anthropologist David Graeber. It's quoted a lot, and I mean, I think it's it's the basis from which we have to operate, which is the world is something we make, and we could just as well make otherwise. And this isn't something, having, like you say, cutting down trees to build detached suburban houses. That's a normative statement, right? It becomes naturalized as like, this is just how capitalism works, or zoning laws, or this is just the way that we live, or this is just what people want, right? And people should be able to get what they want. But these are life choices. These are arrangements of how we've decided to live. And there's a growing movement, for example, called degrowth, which is trying to reorient our sort of societal focus from being one that's about economic growth, the continual, put a increase of throughput through the economy, more nature through the economy, more energy through the economy, so we can supposedly innovate, or everyone can, their standard of living can go up, or whatnot, whatever the arguments usually are. But I think, often I think they operate this argument, this degrowth argument operates from a position that is, one, we're already an exceptionally rich society, and a society that does not distribute its wealth. And so we could increase the living standards of all if we did distribute that wealth. But further, really, I think they're trying to argue is that the center of life, the center of value of life, shouldn't be growth and work, right? The things that matter to humans are relationships with their community, are, a walkable place to live that's pleasant, our trees, our connection to nature around them, is leisure time to express themselves creatively, or, just take naps. These are what is, they're asking, what is the purpose of living life? And they're trying to say, well, we have to get our priorities crooked, because the way they are now is just leading to all of these, social, environmental problems, which don't need to happen, a lot of them, if we were to reorient towards the things that matter, which is living a full life, a fulfilled life, right? And we could design, to bring it back to the question of like housing, is if we designed our cities, our towns, right, in different ways to encourage that kind of thing, rather than building, little boxes on the hillside where everyone has 2 cars and you can't walk to even a grocery store, right? This is a very alienating way to live. And not only is it alienating, it also takes up a lot of space. It's also very inefficient. You're already seeing in the United States that there are towns in the Southwest that can't provide water for themselves because they've built the little suburbs out into the desert, which is an extremely inefficient way to live and not really appropriate to the bioregion. So if we were to, humble ourselves to some degree and reorient to what is the purpose of being alive, there's already so much we could do, right? And which could help address, the fact of homelessness, which is a pretty unnecessary thing in like a unprecedentedly rich society. Could help address the absurd nature of sprawl. We experienced that living in Duval, just the like increasing sprawl of the bedroom communities for Boeing, for Amazon, for Microsoft, as people who buy over expensive Teslas want to, I understand that they want to live on, the Snoqualmie Valley is a really nice valley. I understand the desire to live there. But we can decide to all live in a better way if we work together and we reorient our lives. But this is a very difficult thing to achieve, clearly.
It's so difficult because, like that was a small farm town, and in less than half a decade, it's like people are just outhoused. And
and before that, Carnation was a company town, right, named after Carnation Dairy. Right, it used to be Toll. So it was already, capital was already there.
But now new developed houses are going for over $1 million, or they were last year. They were built last year and went on the market last year when things were stupid. And they were over $1 million, and they're still there, and they're not going to get that. But it's like the quickness of the build for the profit. That's actually something I said on the record is the highest and best use land, which if people don't know, in the real estate book, the highest and best use of land is tied to profit on paper. And like saying that it's that money is not the best use, I feel like just enemy is a strong word, but it's like I also want companies like builders to be incentivized to build affordable housing for people that really, really, really need it. Like that, some of these answers for the homelessness issue aren't based around the real human need. Or like you're talking about people living with the walkability to like the light rails around here. That's what they're doing, is trying to put more of the housing closer to rail, like public transportation areas. And the changing in zoning and coding is just such a brutal process. Like the way that it's like, okay, here's what's happening, here's how we stop it, and look at the issues that have come up because of the way we think we can fix things. So I'm really interested in the future of the affordability thing too. So
For sure. And I mean, the thing I think we have to remember is, you know, the fact that it's difficult now is the result of decisions in the past,
yeah.
right? You know, like I was born in Montreal, come from a city with an excellent transit system, an extensive metro, and I've used it my entire adult life. And it's great. And, you know, that was a choice that the city made at a certain point. And, you know, there are cities throughout Europe that have better transit systems. You know, in North America, there are very few excellent transit systems. You know, and a big part of this is just the particularly North American obsession with the car. And, you know, which is all bound up with histories of white flight and, you know, like there's a long, I mean, this is not my area of specialty, but these are all choices that we've made. And I think we lose sight of the fact that like society is something that we make. So, you know, it's not intractable. These are not intractable problems. It's not just, you know, the state just isn't there and there forever and unmovable, right? Everything is dynamic. So, you know, and every major, let's say, you know, civil rights achievement in the United States was the result of, you know, consistent public action, right? Things can be changed as values change. And I think, you know, we live in a cynical time, understandably. You know, I was present, for example, in Montreal when the largest climate protests in North America happened, 1 million people. And Greta Thunberg was there, and you know the UN released a report, I think today, detailing how we're still going right off the cliff. So it's easy to become cynical, certainly.
Yeah, but it's so easy. The values you said, though, I'm obsessed with this, like the story that we tell ourselves about how there's just no hope. And we've spoken about because I find over and over that I do value hope. I think that's why I wanted to become a teacher, doing the apprenticeship with youth now with WAS, and like learning that I really, really want to impact the lives of children to instill this idea that things can get better, because a lot of their notions already are like, well, humans are the scourge of the earth. And I'm like, what? You're 10.
Where'd you
And
get that? Yeah.
yeah. And I had a similar upbringing for different for different reasons, like more of a spiritual aspect of like why humans aren't great, but they come from this environmental, like the nature would be better. I mean, like I had a kid flat out say the world would be healthier if humans weren't in it. And I'm like, that, what does that story, how, you know, we live out this, I don't want to cross stories here, but like to live out as a culture, that cynicism, the impact that it's playing, is that related to the fact that we're not actually getting anything done? Because I feel like, you know, is that why you're doing what you're doing? Because you do think things are worth changing and we can do it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we can do it. You know, I'm just a person who I don't have a godlike view of history, but I don't think that changes anything, because we should do it. And I think that from all of my scholarly, you know, research, there seems to be evidence that many human cultures have achieved styles of living that have not utterly trashed the landscapes in which they live. And in fact, the evidence seems to suggest that, you know, so human beings since the Holocene have, you know, for the past over 10,000 years, have radically changed almost every environment on the planet. Obviously, not really the poles, until like recently. And you know, it's not a contemporary thing. It's not just a result of colonialism or even agricultural civilization or something. But the evidence seems to suggest that much of that interaction, much of that, you know, relationship that changed landscapes was in a lot of places throughout the world resulted in increased biodiversity. And that includes like all contemporary major biodiversity reserves or parks, or the United States is full of some excellent parks, and all of those things. There's no such thing as untouched nature. There never was. And so the thing that I think that's really important that displays to us is that when we're talking about natural places and valuing a certain type of, let's say, like biodiversity or fecundity over a suburb, what we're really arguing about is not whether or not humans are touching nature or humans are involved in nature or whatever terms you want to use. What we're really discussing is how, because all of these places have been touched by humans. So the question is what kind of culture, what kind of style of living encourages a relationship with the natural world that supports natural fecundity, and what kinds of styles of living destroy natural fecundity. And we seem to be, at least in the contemporary industrial world, really favoring the latter of those two. And so, but I think that the insight of anthropology is that this isn't the natural, inevitable way of human living, and that humans have lived in many, many different ways, some of which in ways beyond that are like seemingly completely anomalous sometimes, and many of those perhaps provide at least maybe hope, maybe inspiration, but at least an understanding that we don't have to live this way. We've just enmeshed ourselves in this like system of dependencies that makes it really hard to get out, right? Because there's so many people and there's such a large industrial system that spans the globe that's keeping us all alive and warm, or some of us at least, right? Obviously not all of us. And it's hard to get out of this system, or to like take control of it in any way. It's very complex, and it elaborates its own, it has certain path dependencies, but we have to try or else it's just going to get worse.
Yep. Amen. Oh, the stories. I'm thinking of, can we go into story?
Yeah, this was the other thing. Sorry, I was going to say, I forgot.
Okay.
Was, I mean, like, yeah, that story of a fundamentally broken humanity, that inevitably will destroy the verdant garden of nature. This is a historically conditioned story that comes from a particular culture, right? And like the many people have pointed this out. I mean, like you said, from a particularly religious background, right? Like this story has very deep Christian overtones, and like structure to it. A fallen humanity in a fallen world that must potentially, atone for its sins, and if not, be sent to the fires. This is a cultural story that's very deeply ingrained in our society, and it gets taken up now in an environmental context, and then given to 10-year-olds without us even thinking about it sometimes, right? Because we just believe it because it's just there. It's always been there, that story.
Can I just say it fills me with rage? I've been unpacking like if I should or shouldn't be angry at their beliefs, because I want to talk about belief. What the hell is that? But it does. It just sparks something very, very sad in me, I think.
It's a very sad conception of what it means to be human, You know, I don't I don't think the anthropological record doesn't seem to indicate that all humans are like this.
True.
And so you know, it's a provincial idea that exists within a certain historical time period among certain people. And you know, maybe that's why we're just going full steam ahead, because we just think, well, it's inevitable anyways. There's no use. There's no use fighting our nature. And so, like, you know, human nature claims, assumptions about what we are often pre-reflexive. We don't even think about them, right? We just take them for granted. And so, you know, that's one of the insights of anthropology, which is trying to question even the most basic ideas about what, you know, a certain culture might think of, usually our own, as natural.
What I find to be natural, a natural pattern in history over and over, is the story of we have to leave this place, and I want to leave this place, and then this point of we must leave. There's a lot of reasons. I mean, in the real estate world, right, it's death, divorce, and disaster. So when disaster strikes, we have to, and I see the opposite of that, like the light side of those reasons for moving around the world and the need for humans. It is our nature to move across land. And the times when people just up and get off the land and go somewhere completely new and call it a home is like this. I heard it one time talked about as like, what is it? Like the opposing myths of like the explorer and then like the homesteader. So like the sacred home and then the sacred journey, these back and forth of the natural human experience that maybe we can do both, but and when people say no, I will not leave, versus that yes, we have to leave. And I think maybe essentially I'm talking about colonization, but also like the defense of land and yeah, I feel like I'm breaking apart this maybe a little bit too much, but I'm interested in these stories, like the way we negatively or positively view people moving across land and finding new places to call home. And like the refugee, I mean, I remember my whole life, I remember as a little kid being like, why do people have to like leave their homeland and come to another country? Why are people so obsessed with, why are refugees all over the news? Like what? And then as an adult, still like grappling with this question. Do you have any thoughts on that? I don't know if I have a direct question, but the land and the politics of land, and I mean, politics, saying land use is just politics. I've learned this now, but like, it's so much more than that, you know? And I think the stories we tell ourselves about the why and the how, and those, you know, those values and those preconceived notions that we have affect the way we view others who do or don't.
I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, one of the things that always makes me think of is space colonization as a sort of expression of we have to get out of here.
Yeah.
Something's going to go bad here. We have to escape, which I think is fundamentally I've always perceived it as, well, one, it's childish and uh, uh, cowardly, but it's also a fear of intimacy, I think, in a lot of ways, which is, you know, there's a lack of an ability to you know, accept and trifle with your problems, and to accept that, you know, change and pain are part of life, and that you can't just always run. And obviously this is all like constrained within a very uh, you know, economically privileged you know, ideology of like who's going to be able to even get off the planet. Is this even a useful use of resources in the first place? But Yeah, I mean, there's the question of, what is the motivation to leave? Are you being forced from where you live because of environmental injustice, because of political injustice, because of, like my ancestors left Eastern Europe because, they didn't want to be pogromed anymore, or didn't want to get cracked down, um, or get killed by the Tsarist army, or, and so they left and they came here to North America. So I think that was a good decision, at least for me. Now, they weren't able to choose, or they were able to choose at least. They weren't really able to choose to stay. Um, but, I think that one of the things that you're pulling on is like I guess the tension between like the domestic and the nomadic, maybe. Like the place-based and the journey. Um, and like for instance, in North America, a lot of indigenous people who live here, particularly foraging peoples, um, and then yeah, foraging peoples, broadly speaking, their conception of home, of place, is something much wider and larger than like a contemporary city dweller or town dweller or something would think of, right? You spend, let's say up here in Quebec, where I spend my summers, you spend one season down by the fleuve, by the ocean, fishing and enjoying yourself, and you spend the other season upriver, way far away, right? And this is all part of home, right? But you live in more than one place, and you do that every year, right? So there's not a single location that's home, but all of that landscape is part of your larger relationality, right? And I think this is something that we often, and this is, you see this particular tension in the United States a lot, which is a very mobile, let's say, culture. Many people live somewhere they weren't born and have moved 5 times in their life. The thing you often, I mean, it's true in Canada up here too, but it's particularly true in the United States, where you ask someone where they're from and they give you 5 different places. Well, like, I was born here, but like really what matters is I was raised here. But like also the most important part is here, and like what does it do to a person to be attached to all these different places? Does that hold you back from establishing a sense of home, or does that extend your sense of home? I don't know. It would be cool to be able to have a somewhat nomadic life. We don't really create a society that's for that, like structurally. But people do it.
I'm thinking of this group called, well, I don't even know if I should. Nomad Nation is this little emerging group that's trying to connect people who are mobile and travel and with their work and livelihoods and places for them to build community across like large stretches of place. And I keep hearing that as this theme that people are envisioning. And I think it takes, engagement with these systems of actually building new infrastructure that
Mhm.
to me isn't just because you were saying within walking distance of a community they love, and I had these preconceived like my idea of that is like a walking village in a place with enough land to grow food that actually sustains us mostly. And you don't need a ton of space to do that, but a decent amount of people with a similar vision is what's needed, and a lot of people share that vision. But I didn't think that could be done in like 20-story apartment buildings with the light, little gardens here and there. But it is the Cape that is possible too. That is home and community for a lot of people. And it's really cool to see that manifest in so many different ways, this idea of home. And I love that my vision of that keeps evolving and emerging with the more stories I gather. So
And I mean, this isn't like a new thing. So like there are arguments that, I'm just always bringing this back to anthropology.
right.
There are arguments that like, one of the elements of native North America before colonization, was that, I mean, there's evidence of this fact very obviously, that like there are massive trade coast to coast all over. They find for a very long time. They find Clovis points, flint knappable stone from, in caches that have stone from 20 different places in North America, which is astounding to really think about,
It's so
right?
cool. Yeah,
Um,
it is.
like we think of gold as a contemporary phenomenon, right? But these people were traveling large distances and relating to their neighbors and trading, things from one ecology to another that wasn't accessible. And, so one of the arguments is that like travel and like hosting of travelers um, from other groups of people was actually like a much more common thing than has often been thought. And so, I mean, to some degree, like, is that what like nomad nation is reaching for, right? Is like a culture of hospitality, right? That
Yeah.
you'll always care for others who are traveling just as uh, they will care for you. And the focus on hospitality is like a very common, you know, um, cultural value in these kinds of societies, right? Like it's still a cultural value throughout, like, the Arab world, with long traditions of this going back, hundreds, if not thousands of years. So it's a very different sort of form of society, right? And for us, I think a lot of people are trying to sort of drop out of contemporary order. It's very hard to buy a house. It's very hard to rent. It's very hard to interact with all the structures of control that requires, right? Like you have to participate in a capitalist economy to get money to then pay your rent on a house that someone else actually owns. And
For
people just start
years.
fed
I
up with
mean,
that. Like,
if you want home ownership access, which ownership is just to me a ticket to steward land the way you want to. And in order to do that, you have to have certain years of participating in all of that in good standing to then be qualified. And there's a process for it all, but hospitality, the value of hospitality, I find this over and over. The United States, we're huge on hospitality. There's restaurants and hotels everywhere, but that's the
but
societal norm for what we consider hospitable. And
yeah,
it's
it's
just,
hospitality only in the capitalist marketplace,
and you have
right?
to
It's
pay
you must
for all of it. There's
exactly.
no neighborhood culture around hospitality anymore. I mean, I think going back to the practices that WASP brought us, I mean, I think that's one reason I still stay in Duval is because, I love living in a smaller community where the vibe is travelers welcome here. Like, come tell us your stories. Where have you been? How did you end up here? And it's just this, again, confluence of stories. And then we all go, back out and keep
Yeah, it was one of
connecting.
my favorite parts about living there was like just showing up at other people's houses, or like you come home and there's just like people there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think one of the jokes that people make about um, university in the United States, I mean, this has become a big political thing in the United States. Obviously, like university is absurdly expensive in the United States and has
It's
been
terrible.
captured. They've become neoliberal institutions that sell social standing, basically. Um,
Ideologies.
yeah, and this was not the origin. This was not the intention, at least recently, of the universities. But there's a whole other discussion. But the reason why people, I think for a lot of people who went or as you call it in the States, college, um, there's a lot of nostalgia for people who did go to college. They remember this as like their best time. And one of the reasons that they do that, and I think don't think about it this way sometimes, is that they lived in a walkable neighborhood with all of their friends, and they hung out with each other, and they had intellectual discussions, and they like got to have parties and play sports together and whatever, right? Could this just not be the way that we organize society anyways, right? But we don't, because then you leave, and then you're supposed to face a sort of quote unquote real world, right? But those are all things that make life good.
Yeah.
So why don't we do that?
I'm thinking of these kids that I saw this morning on my way here at the waiting for the school bus or carpool or something. They were at that hairpin turn, and there was this group of kids, and I saw them all kind of like getting out of their cars and meeting each other, and all the parents are standing, and it's sweet. It's a sweet moment. All the parents are smiling because like, oh, their kids are, they spent the whole day apart, these kids, and now they're reuniting with with the connection that matters the most to them, which are the people they spend time with. They're friends. Yeah. And like, even this work culture of, I think about this line from The Office all the time, like, business is always personal. I personally, I know a lot of people don't, at least around me, have this philosophy that like, I want my work to be my love. I want my connections to be what I do and the action I have in the world. And I want it to be authentic and genuine, and that to have meaning. And I'm like, that's what that childlike passion is, that these kids were, that it's just this assumed thing that it's just lost, once you reach adulthood, that like, then you have to wake up to the real world where you don't enjoy seeing the people that you're around every day. And it's just like, what story is shifting from that we just stop believing in?
What's the line, like, put away childish things? So I mean, this is like, their long history. I mean, a lot of this is the result of, like, it's been argued, the Protestant work ethic. There are a lot of things, the capitalist, like, marketization of increasing amounts of our lives as it just takes more and more, right? For example, I think this goes to like the heart of some struggle in the United States, is one throughout everywhere. So, the contemporary capitalist economy was set up to be nuclear families in their own houses, with one person, always the male, who worked and supported the family, and the woman did the reproductive labor, cooking, cleaning, and all that, raising the children, deeply important things that the society requires to happen to continue to exist. And one of the responses to this was, well, this is obviously unfair, and women should be liberated to be part of the market and should be able to pursue their own dreams. And that's a really good and important thing. But it's also left us in a situation where now no one does reproductive labor in the house. And that's not to say that that was a bad development, but that's to say that, like, it reveals further structural problems in our society, which is like, we don't have communities, right, that are there to care for the young, right? That's another market, right? That's daycare. That's other people are paid to do that, and their labor is used. So, rather than remove things from the market by having, walkable communities where you can go drop off some kids with the grandparents, or like someone who just likes hanging out with kids will hang out with the kids, or whatever it is, there are all these different ways that we could arrange our societies, or we could all just like work less, maybe. That might be helpful. So, it's just, we're on every front, like, we're dehumanized, right? And like, more of our relationships, whether it's to each other or to the natural world, are taken from us and objectified or marketized, or captured and then sold back to us, so that like more and more can be just be, as the alienation increases, more and more can be taken off the top, and siphoned by the people who own things, right? This is not a very good way of arranging society.
Extracted from us, right? Yeah. You say objectified. That's an interesting word, because I think that's one reason that women were like, we want to work too. Because we aren't just the reproductive object that stays home and does that part of society. And I hear sometimes the phrase Mother Nature, Father Culture, but I recently got this book actually called Mother Culture, and I was like, fascinating, because it does seem like this merging. I'm also, I love the spiritual concept of the divine feminine and the divine masculine, and the ways that they are the same but different, or polarities maybe. But seeing these roles like in culturally shift in like a couple generations, very, like, and our generation is just like smashing all the identities, right? So who's going to take up that nature and culture role then, if not assigned roles? How, and maybe that goes back to the practices of recreating culture. Like maybe it's just a collection, an ecology of practices, but maybe it's more than that.
Yeah, well, I think one, like the ideas of nature and culture are Western ideas. Um,
Mm.
they like literally do not exist in other societies. The notion that there is a thing that is separate from humans that can be called nature is just not a concept. Um, so, you know, and the gendering of that, right? That like women are natural in some sense, and like mothering, I guess, and they do the reproductive labor, and like men um, are build things, I guess, and like conduct the work of society and whatnot. Obviously, this is like a very particular historical way of thinking about the world that's like not objective or real. But like here's an interesting counterexample from like super early anthropology. Margaret Mead, who's probably like the most famous anthropologist ever, she wrote a book called I'm gonna get it wrong, but I think it was called Sex and Temperament in Three Societies. Um, and I think it was in Polynesia. It might have been Papua. I'm really revealing my academic ignorance. Um, but the point being is she studied three different societies along the same river. And she showed that the gender roles in these societies were radically different, even though they were basically neighbors. And one that always stuck out to me, not just me, was there was one of these societies that um, the women conducted all of the economic work. They did all the wheeling and dealing. They, made sure there was food and all of that. And the men just sat around gambling, preening themselves, and gossiping. Um, and so, this is it's presented often as a sort of like reverse of our, 1950s maybe conception of what the Western society could be, right? So it just goes to show you that, you know, we decide how to arrange these things. And, not every society has two genders, and not every society, breaks down labor along those gender lines in the same way. Often the gendered breakdown of those roles is a lot more equal than it has been the case in our society for a long time. Sometimes it's equally terrible, if not worse. So, it's all contingent. I'm not willing to make any statements about like the naturalness of any of these things. But I think what's important is that, we should be attentive to, again, like the practices that matter to make life good, right? How to raise healthy children, however we arrange our societies, right? Like whatever sexualities, whatever sexual or gender identities, whatever kinship structures, whatever it is. But the point is to raise good people, right? Who relate to each other well and shepherd good relationships in the natural world. That's what matters, right? And I think we lose sight of this a lot of the time by getting caught up in like our own. We're scared of losing all of our received ideas, which is completely understandable. It's very scary. But perhaps there's an opportunity there, to refashion a society that doesn't seem to be working very well. I'm trying to be hopeful.
Hopeful or helpful?
Hopeful.
Hopeful. I thought you didn't believe in hope.
Not particularly, but sometimes you have to try.
Hopeful enough, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I have two threads in my mind where maybe they're related. Belief and comfort. Like we're too afraid to change, but I also think we're too afraid of being uncomfortable. And this deep reminder through my experience at Wilderness Awareness School is learn how to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. And and one reason I part of my brain just thinks I'm destined to fail in real estate, because I'm like, this is so uncomfortable and I can't tell anymore, like what's an edge I need to push and what's a, you know, wall I need to back away from. But I believe and am hopeful enough that I can push past this comfort to create something beautiful. Whatever that is, I don't know right now, but there is this necessity and disdain for comfort. What do you see as like maybe the edge for discomfort in like the ways we are shifting our relationship to this new identity of like stewards for the earth, like as humans who are already here? It's the how, like you were saying. It's going to be uncomfortable though for a lot of people.
For sure. I mean, I think that one, it's already very uncomfortable for very many people.
Right.
Like all of those unhoused population we were talking about, right? The society is full of people who are very uncomfortable to understate it. So it's, you know,
But it's
certain
like
classes of people are becoming uncomfortable, right? Some of that's because they fear certain things are being taken away from them. Some of that is, you know, traumatic responses, because, you know, even those people who are, you know, quote unquote, the most privileged in our society still live in a society that's not very humane. And, you know, they've probably been raised in ways that have done profound damage to themselves as well. Not to say, this is not to justify anything, any actions, but you know, it's very scary to lose your culture. So, I mean, here's an analogy. Like, there's a concept in anthropology called culture shock, and there's a related concept called life shock. And so, you know, an anthropologist is supposed to go from their home culture and go to another place that's different. This is sort of like the traditional idea, right? And become other, attempt to become other, right? And there's a, you know, as your connection to your own culture starts to wane, as you're in a new cultural milieu, right? You don't know anyone here, you're learning totally new ways of being, new language, new whatever it is. You reach a point where you feel no longer whatever you were before, but not yet what you are to become potentially. You feel lost. And this is called culture shock, because often people will just like go to their bed and sleep for 2 weeks, or like they get profoundly depressed because they don't know, they feel unmoored. They feel like there's no structure to the world anymore, right? They don't know who they are. And there's a sort of more radical version of this, which is called life shock, which is like you go to a place and you experience something that you would never experience in your life, in your housing culture, and your body just rejects it. Like you just throw up. And, you know, maybe there's an analogy here for what's happening, right? It's like, it's a very scary thing to lose all of your touchstones, right? And all of your, you know, whatever it is, whatever your vision, your cultural construction of the world, it's very disarming and vulnerable and scary to lose those things, or to feel like they're getting taken away, whether or not that's true. And so like, it's understandably a scary process. But, you know, if we engage, this is what I think is really interesting about places like WAS, is that they're engaging in this kind of thing very consciously, right? Rather than just sort of like give themselves to the whim of history, they're trying to build new language, right? Shared language, shared practices, shared cultural structures, right? They're not a complete society, right? I mean, they're a nonprofit organization that has all of these, you know, they have to pay their mortgage on their land, or they have to, you know, pay their employees, and they have to raise money, and they have to, you know, they're not a village, right? And they can't be, maybe, in our present conditions, but they're still trying to build, they're trying to sort of take the reins and build new ways of relating, and you know, new sort of like eco-cultural identity, right? And it seems pretty effective, right? I mean, we're talking to each other right now. It seems like places like this are able to tap into something that humans, contemporary, mostly settler descended humans are the, something missing, something, or to provide something that is profound enough, or useful enough, or fulfilling enough that people like you stick around in the Snoqualmie Valley. People like me keep returning. So I think they often say this. They say, we don't know what we're doing exactly. We don't have an ultimate vision, but the proof is in the pudding in some sense. Like we see it's doing something. And it's interesting to really think about the conscious practices or semi-conscious. Sometimes just things come up, right? But they're oriented towards something larger than just like survivalism, or like connecting to nature, knowing plants, or community, sharing, or whatever it is. It's a larger thing that they're building. They're building like a whole cultural universe, I guess.
Wow, yeah, I had not tied that together until this moment, maybe, that like part of why there is a sense of home among, I mean, for me, and people come from all over the world, so I'm not making a blanket statement. My experience is like from being a pioneer descended person, not feeling like I have that felt sense of home and place, and then feeling at home with others who also don't feel at home, and like why that convergence happens, and what and I struggle with this. Like I struggle with this like, especially with land use, and well, whose land,
For sure.
and trying to create relationship with it, because something in me believes that everyone deserves that sense of belonging, and that's what that's the culture recreate. I mean, what is that? What is belonging? Why is that come up so often in, I don't mean to ask you questions like what is belonging, but I know I did that with belief at one point. Like, what is the anthropological stance on belief? But there's something in me that thinks that sense is a human right nature. I'm not going to make same, and I don't feel like we're here
Yeah,
to
I
do it,
mean,
but there's something in that, like the people who were like, no, I'm not selling this land. It's like, I'm not asking you to, but that defense of like, this is my place. Like there's something.
for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, all of this questions of property, which we don't think about it like this often, but their property is essentially a social relationship, right? It's not an objective thing. It's a relationship between people. It's not a relationship between people and objects. It's, this is my land means you can't use it, other humans, right? That's what it fundamentally means. But, issues of property, issues of, hundreds of years of coloniality, right? These are all, or of continued extractive industries. These are all, terrible, um, a matrix of like terrible imperial, systems that we're all enmeshed in. And we're in varying positions within those systems in different ways, right? Which in many ways are not of our doing, right? You didn't choose to be here, you just are.
Yeah.
And so how can you be ethical while still, trying to not be a natural alien, right? To like find your birthright in a certain sense, right? And I think that it's true. You always want to get in the call, don't you?
Bonus
Um,
Zoom points.
yeah. And you know, I think it does. People want to belong where they are, and people want to feel like they have relationships with place, and with non-human others, right? Not just human others, but you know, John Young always used to say, people only protect what they love. Um, and I've always sort of perceived the project of places like WAS, which is like learning to teach people how to love again, natural places, right? Or each other. It's, because it requires a certain vulnerability, right, of the self to be able to like open yourself to trying to love a place or to love beings that are so different from you that it's so hard to understand them, right? They're not easy to control. I mean, I can pick him up, right? But it's not easy to control or like understand how he communicates, right? It requires like a commitment to trying to understand the other, which is always true of any relationships, right? But I mean, I guess we find home in each other, right? I mean, that's just what it is to be like an animal on this planet, I guess, right? Because the world is it's constituted by others. That's what the world is, right? Like we live on this sphere where just like a mesh of life lives that just constitutes itself, right? Like which controls the climate so that it can continue to exist, right? There's no not nature. You're always enmeshed in circuits of ingestion, right? Of waste, of relationality. We've eliminated that to increasing degrees, that like sense, that felt sense of that in our societies, right? As we live in boxes that are climate controlled and our food comes in, whatever, cellophane, etc. But like you are always already enmeshed, right? So I think what places like WASP do, which is really interesting, is learning their practices of attention, of awareness to that fact, and of cultivating like modes of listening, of seeing, um, of discerning other, the non-human other particularly, because we're not raised to do that in our societies often. These are like new skills to many people. To many people throughout the world, they're not new skills, and they're much more developed, right? And it seems to, from my ethnographic research among people like us, it seems to really feed something that people need.
Cultivating modes of seeing. I love that. I wrote it down. Because as a new dog owner, I'm a new dog mom to an 8-month-old giant dog. And
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's like a relationship that I so much more complicate. I think someone's knocking at the door, but I'm going to let them. Sorry. Yeah. Damn it. Oh, seeing like trying to understand, yeah, this new relationship of I guess I had a question earlier that maybe I'll just ask you now, is how do you see, and feel free not to answer this, but the archetype of the scout is one I've worked with a lot, and like becoming like trying to think like my dog, which I love canine, like just that was a beautiful thing for me in understanding tracking, like canine and feline tracking, and like all these patterns between different species of animals, and like identifying birds by their behavior, not just their sound or their colors, like their location of place and space.
Mm-hmm.
And becoming, you said earlier, I was thinking like my thespian world of method acting. It's like that you're kind of becoming and breaking away from an identity and becoming a new identity and learning something in that process. And I was fascinated with WASP because they talk about this archetype in the marketing and everything. And that's an archetype very dear to me because maybe that's another discussion. But what do you see as that archetype? Like, what is that archetype to you? And do you find that related to to what we're talking about, like learning these different modes of seeing and becoming.
Yeah, I've always the line that has always conjured to mind when Wass talks about the Scout is a line by Leonard Cohen, my hometown boy, um, which is I live among you well disguised. And I mean, to some degree, I feel like that's my role as an academic. You know, I have to engage with large institutions and systems of power, and you know, one has to speak and think and present in certain disciplined ways. But can that be done? Is that you know, can that be done for as a tactic, right? For the good, right? As a helping, you know, translate maybe or infect, you know, places like stodgy institutions with, you know, wisdom gleaned out by people doing things out in the world, right? How can you be a scout in that sense, right? And I think there's another element of that where, like you were saying, with, you know, bird language and tracking, which is there's a sort of like quieting of the self, right? To let in the communication and the beingness of others, right? That's what sit spotting is. That's what the tracking in bird language is like, how can you be there in a way where you're educating your attention, right? To become used to the presence of other beings and to not like define them by your concepts or define them by whatever is on your mind at the time or your distraction or whatever it is, right? And it's the same with human relationships, right? Like, have the people who are closest to you, who you spend the most amount of time with, you can tell from just, you know, a fraction of seeing a tiny, you know, movement of their face, what their mood is, right? Or how they respond to something, a fleeting gesture, right? The same thing is true of non-humans. It's just that we don't come to know them to the same degree, right? And I think that that's what places like WAS are devoted to, right? Which is like becoming that intimate with the non-human. It's not about knowing taxonomy or track patterns or the amount of the different languages of the birds, or you know, is this an umbrella or is this well, you know, whatever it is. Those are all tools, right? I think it seems to me like fundamentally a desire for intimacy. Do you feel that also? I don't know.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like, I feel like the more I get to know every sound of the creatures that inhabit my place with me. I mean, I that everyone has different connection points, but for me, like hearing and getting to know the patterns of the sounds around me. I mean, like that I wasn't expecting the culture shock of different patterns of trees and birds to be as impactful as it was, because I lived my whole life in Western Missouri, in the middle of the country, landlocked, and just the sheer like being around seabirds, you know, is a different experience. It's a different felt experience, and like the taste of the minerals in the water and the way that the air smells and everything is so different in every aspect of every shift of every season. And
Yeah.
so many, when people move and move and move all over the country and other countries and don't take that in as a factor of their experiences, like it's just easier, I think, to tune it out. And because you kind of have to, because it's overwhelming. I mean, I drove like 2,000 miles over a couple days in January to bring Artemis, my dog, up from Missouri. And I was like, just that it took me so long to recover, because just moving across that much land, it's shocking. And to become place takes sitting still and listening, and it is so countercultural and terrifying,
For sure.
because the
For
fear of
sure.
it, like, I love that you're relating it back to fear of intimacy, because there's this line of a song that I really like: the loss of love is just fear in disguise.
Yeah.
And yeah.
We're not very good at dealing with this kind of grief in our society. And I think that's why it comes up so much at schools like this. I mean, it's a particularly North American even orientation to life, which is that like loss must not be spoken of, right? Um, the United States is a particularly cheery country in some respects. Um, a sort of toxic positivity towards life, which doesn't acknowledge, that life is fundamentally undergirded by loss. That's what it is to be alive, right? Like, is to lose things you love inevitably, eventually, right?
Yeah.
Like, for instance, when I adopted Milo, who's sitting right there, I sat with him and I thought to myself, can I accept the fact that I will come to love this cat and then I will have to experience the loss of this cat? And I said yes. And I said, okay, we can adopt him. Because you have to understand that, like, it's coming for you, it's coming for all of us, right? Like, the great joys and the great losses. That's all part of the texture of the human experience, right? And we hide from the losses.
I love that, the texture of the human experiences. That's one reason, is like with this reimagining homing and housing, literally, because I keep coming to, like, is it an idea structure, or is it a physical, like, building infrastructure shift that needs to happen? And I think it's both. But housing, for me, what I want to live on someday, how I want to live, is housing the elders among our everyday, like, all stages of life. Essentially, that's the texture of the human experiences, that, like, birth and death being a norm with it, like, on shared land where all stages of life interact, is just non-existent. Like, we ship off our elders to homes. That's just a normal thing. Our babies are delivered in places that, like, well, that's another topic. But that it's those broken up things means that the texture of all of it just gets so compartmentalized that, like, the richness of the whole is lost, it seems.
For sure. And it's like a particular way of organizing our lives, right? Where we just sort of wall off further and further, like, unpleasantness, I guess, right? And like difficulty, the difficulties of relationality, right? Like, relationalities fundamentally require some difficulty, because it's just beings interact, and they don't always interact without friction, right?
Yeah.
It's not, you're not always going to like everything your grandparents say, or it's not necessarily going to be pretty when you give birth, or it might be very painful, or whatever. But just because you put that behind a wall doesn't mean it doesn't happen, right?
Yeah.
There's a famous line. I think it's apocryphal, but it's anthropologists like to say it. Because I think it was Margaret Mead again in her later life, which is a young student asked her, how do you know when you've become an anthropologist? And she said, have you ever seen anyone die? And they said no. And she nodded. She said, have you ever been present when anyone was born? And they said no. And Margaret Mead said, well, you're not an anthropologist then. And I mean, I think to some degree that's not true for like the actual discipline of anthropology, and is that required, and whatever. But I think there's a sort of larger point, which is just that, like, nothing that is human is alien to me, right? It's like the purpose, I guess, if I'm going to make some, call for the relevance of my discipline, which is a fraught, discipline with complicated colonial heritage and all of that, is to say that we're gonna have to pause. Okay, we're good.
I'm really sorry about that. Yes, please. Maybe could you
Fine.
start your sentence?
I'll start with the story again. How about
Okay,
that?
thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a famous and oft-quoted line from Margaret Mead again, but I think this story is apocryphal. I've never been able to find any indication that this is actually true or actually happened, but it's oft repeated, and is that later in her life, Margaret Mead was asked by a young student, something to the effect of, how do you know when you're an anthropologist? How do you know when you've like achieved being an anthropologist? She paused and she asked the student, have you ever been present when anyone died? And the student shook their head, and Margaret Mead paused. And she said, well, have you ever been present when anyone was born? And the student shook their head again. And Margaret Mead said, well, then you're not an anthropologist. And while I don't think this is necessarily true for, disciplinarily for actually being an anthropologist and like being able to do good work as an anthropologist or anything, I've never seen anyone be born, so I'm disqualified. But I do think it just points to a larger sort of ambition of anthropology, which is to take in the human experience in its fullness, right? Both within a certain culture, right? All aspects, life and death, right? But also cross-culturally, the varying, radically different ways that different people engage with joy and grief, life and death, right? And, I think that it requires a certain courage, I guess, to be able to, and vulnerability to do that, because it requires like questioning the entirety of your, fundamentally the entirety of your worldview, right? If people all around the world do things in totally different ways, maybe they're doing something better in some ways, right? Maybe what you thought is only a partial way of looking at the world, right? I mean, it's always going to be a partial way to look at the world. We're just like some apes on this planet, talking, making sounds to put ideas in each other's heads. But, we should be open to the idea that, to underline it again, right? Like, our society doesn't have to be this way. It's a decision we make, right? Other people decide to do other things.
I only have a couple more questions, and I am thinking now of like the ritual of bitterness. I know I mentioned to you, I'm obsessed with this concept of bitterness, and what as an herbalist, my personal ritual of microdosing bitterness was eating bitter herbs and bitter prepared herbal medicines and plant and bitter foods, and really sitting with bitterness as a theme in my life with the actual taste. And we go back to the felt sense of actually the importance of experiencing things like like my idea for housing elders and various transitions of life from birth on the same within walking distance of a community that supports these things together. That seems kind of like the same concept, almost like keeping it in front of our eyes, this grief that as a whole, this experience is, I don't want to say like, well, it's hard. Life is hard, and like maybe that's why we push away the pain and the fear of intimacy around actually tending to people as they age, or tending to children as they grow, or tending to work differently than what the entire culture around you says is work. Yeah, do you have any thoughts on ritualized bitterness as a taste or emotional experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's insightful to remember that like the North American diet basically eliminates bitterness as a flavor from its like food practices, which is not the case worldwide, right? You know, there's a particular sort of orientation towards what's like culturally inscribed as like unpleasantness, right? There's a particular way of like resisting dealing with unpleasant things. And you know, like there's like a hubris to in our orientation to where like I should never have to experience anything unpleasant, right? And that's both like obviously a very privileged perspective, but it's also like a very misguided perspective because there's a lot of wisdom in unpleasantness, and like it's coming for you either way. So you best learn how to deal with it. And it's, you know, I mean, we do in a lot of ways also live in an extremely unpleasant society. So, you know, and like daily life is very unpleasant a lot of the time, right? Just like you go to the grocery store and there's like irritating noises and loud things trying to sell you stuff that you don't actually need. And then there's just everyone who works there doesn't want to work there because it's a crappy place to work, right? And then you don't have enough money to pay for the food you actually want or that's actually healthy. And right, that's just like one experience you have during your day, right? It's just like constantly unpleasant. So we both like avoid unpleasantness, but also like reproduce a society of profound unpleasantness all the time. So, you know, I think maybe those are two sides of the same coin where it's like being unable to acknowledge, like, I don't like this. Seems like none of us like this. Maybe if we like dwelt with that feeling, we could figure out how to address that situation rather than just like constantly ignoring all of our problems, which is kind of what our orientation as a society is like, it'll fine, like, you know, like we'll figure it out. Shh, just it is fine. Just keep going. Just like very silly way of living. And like it was both irresponsible and like just childish, in like the bad sense of childish. You know, it's like trying to walk on a broken leg. So yeah, I don't know how to. I don't want to be prescriptive about, you know, like how to ritualize these feelings or encountering these feelings, you know. You know, that's like a particular people's, you know, choice or invention or, you know, like you asked me, right? Like at the Pesach Seder, which is coming up in a few weeks, that I'll be, you know, going to, practicing as a Jew. The eating of bitter herbs, they're defined in the Bible as in the Torah as there's supposed to be five. There are options for five. I don't think they're all translatable. We don't know what they all are. Like what the ecology of the time was.
Yeah.
Some of them we do know.
Yeah, and some are different based on region. My plant nerd self really was like, what are the plants?
Yeah. It's really interesting. I've been reading a lot about how the Bible was written and whatever. That's a whole other story. But yeah, I mean, like one of the ritual practices is to eat bitter herbs to remember the bitterness of slavery, right? And I think that there is a wisdom to remembering. I mean, this is one of the insights, at least of the Jewish tradition, is to remember is that it's historical. It's about, you know, morality through history. It's remember there was a time that things were bad. Remember there was a time that you were a slave in Egypt, whether or not this is objectively true, or, you know, whatever your orientation towards this in your faith is, or as an archaeologist or historian or whatever. But I think there is wisdom to say, like, remember you were once a slave in Egypt, and so therefore, you know, be kind to those who are strangers among you, right? Like reminding you that you may be in a time now where you are in a privileged position where you don't have to be fearful of a pharaoh, but other people do. So remember, it once was you. And I think, the remembering of that bitterness is a, it's a it's a structure, it's a practice to make that more embodied. And I think that's what draws me to places like WASP, which is that they're developing those rituals, right? They may not be 5,000 years old, but they're 50 years old. So we'll see where they go. That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't take long to just to reshape how the next 100 views things, like how to embody the bitterness of the human experience, and hiding away our elders and hiding away our children and hiding away from work and life from the rest of your food system, not being connected to the actual food that sustains you. Like, I'm just thinking,
it's so overwhelming. Like, it's, I understand that people want to hide from it. It's like, it's so big. There are so many forces allied against your experience that, like, you're just a little person, how do you resist it all? How do you resist everyone trying to get a little piece of you all the time?
Especially if you have a sensitive nervous system, like a sensitive human being, like we are,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
you have to turn it off. And I see a lot of that in the wilderness community as a whole, is like the need to get away from it all. And
for sure. And I think if we're going to politicize that, right, or put that in a political context, it's like, all of that is like, people need to get away and they need to cultivate different ways of being, right, in different conditions. But what we need to do is create a society that isn't so unpleasant, right, and so disconnected. We need to create, I mean, I think this is what places like WAS are trying to do, is to create, how can we, and they don't know the answer yet and they don't have all the power, but like, how can you build a culture of connection rather than disconnection, right? And often there's a sort of like a separation, right? Like, you're out in the woods or you're in the city. And like, we're cultivating our culture out in the woods separately. But, you have, I mean, like, the classic kind of, you have to be able to live in both worlds. So the question is like, how can we transform the way that we live so that trying to escape all the time isn't the like our motivation all the time,
isn't the best solution.
Yeah, we should create a society that we don't want to escape from. Would be nice.
Yeah. And maybe my naive privileged brain is like, we can,
I hope so.
But I hope, hope
Yeah.
Hope that Nomad Nation, if they help me build a village on the West Coast, hope that they let me put in not that anyone willing to help me build a village. Help me put in, assisted living for elders on the land with us that are a part of our community, and the babies are part of the community, and the educators who will take the gaggle of children out into the forest to teach them the ways of nature and the world. Like, that doesn't seem that far off. I mean, from me and my experience coming from the Midwest culture, where forest schools just aren't a thing, but in this new place that I am, the emphasis on humans connecting to place just seems way more commonplace, and it's not like this in a lot of North America. And
it's even in the 10 years since when I was there the first time, it's growing at like a remarkable rate, for sure.
The need is just, COVID taught me that, like, it's not a luxury to be connected to nature. And I did say this in my public statement. That's why I'm like, man, do I sound like an advocate or a professional? Because it's not a luxury anymore. It's a necessity. We have to move forward with nature, as nature. See, this is like the separation of the things. Oh, my brain's starting to go. So my last question is regarding hope. What gives you hope personally? That our sense of home on this world, and a sense of belonging, like, do you have hope? And if so, what gives you hope that we're heading in the right direction?
I won't say I have hope. And I'll also say that I don't think I require hope.
Hmm.
To me, the right thing to do is still the right thing to do, regardless of if you're going to succeed. And so hope is like in some senses irrelevant, but you know, I do feel there's a lot of space to play. And I think that a lot of people see that. And I think we're becoming increasingly alarmed at the state of things, and also increasingly understanding about what's missing from our lives. Maybe we're not. Maybe, a 4-degree fascist world is our future. But it doesn't have to be. So to me, maybe hope isn't the operative emotion, but having prospects is. We have prospects. We have the ability to change things. So let's just do that then. I don't have to believe that I'll succeed or my children will succeed, but we've done a lot of, humans have lived on this planet in ways that haven't trashed it utterly before and still do now. And so we can do that. It's an option. So let's choose the option that works best.
Awesome. I love that. Let's end there. Thank you, Josh, for coming on to the Home for Humanity podcast and helping me and other people find a home for all the parts of our humanity. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. It was fun talking.